story of Branwen begins on the day that the King of Ireland suddenly came to call, arriving upon the shores of Wales with his fleet, his shield pointing upwards as a sign of peace. And as Bran, the king of the Island of the Mighty, looked out from his seat atop the rocks overlooking the sea, the Irish king Matholwch announced that he had come to ask for the hand of Branwen, Bran's sister, one of the 3 chief maidens of the old tribes, beloved by her people for her gentleness, beauty, and compassion, and revered for her visions which showed the greater scheme of things. This request surprised Bran, for it was certainly not customary for a woman of the old tribes to leave her people and marry a husband from a foreign land, much less Branwen, who was not only a princess, but was to give birth to the next king, as in the old tribes, kingship was passed down through the female line, making her the centre of everything in the kingdom. But nonetheless, Branwen was called for, and she met with King Matholwch to decide for herself whether this was the man that she would choose to be her husband. For though her brothers were hesitant about the unorthodox match, they decided that the ultimate choice should be Branwen's. And sure enough, Branwen and Matholwch found that they could not keep their eyes from one another, and they spent the whole of that evening in deep conversation as a feast was prepared and their marriage performed. And as the men of Ireland and Cymru hunted and feasted in celebration for many days after, Branwen and Matholwch fell more and more in love. However, while the 2 parties celebrated this new union, which brought hope for lasting peace between the Cymru and their Irish neighbours, Branwen's half-brother, Efnisien, a quarrelsome man with a foul temper who could turn even the most loyal and loving brothers against each other, had returned home from his travels, and when he heard about his half-sister's marriage, he was furious that such a decision had been made without him. In his anger, Efnisien cruelly maimed the Irish horses that were resting in Bran's stables, so much so that they could no longer be used for anything. And when news of this insult reached Matholwch and the men of Ireland, they marched back to their ships, stone-faced with anger and baffled as to why such an act would be committed against them after such a great maiden as Branwen had already been given to Matholwch. Bran quickly sent word to Matholwch of the grave misunderstanding and asked that he return to let him make amends on whatever terms he might desire, offering him a healthy horse for each one maimed, a silver rod as thick as his little finger and as tall as himself, and a gold plate as broad as his face. And when the 2 kings came together once more to settle the dispute, sensing that Matholwch was still not satisfied, Bran offered one more boon to add to the recompense. Pair Dadeni, the cauldron of rebirth. Now, this was a mighty gift, for any man slain who was thrown into the cauldron would be revived and would emerge to fight again. But Bran warned the Irish king that while the beings that would emerge from the cauldron would be able to fight as well as they had when they were alive, they would be completely unable to speak. And with that, the deal was settled and the affair put to rights, and Branwen sailed to Ireland with her new husband in good spirits. For a year she prospered there, winning over the people of Ireland with her grace and honour, and she and Matholwch were very happy indeed, and soon Branwen gave birth to a son, Gwern. But then, in the 2nd year, the people of Ireland began to stir with murmurings as news of the maiming of the Irish horses and the insult that their king had suffered in Wales finally reached their ears. They blamed Matholwch for failing to get blood vengeance for the wrongdoing, and demanded that he put Branwen aside and punish her in place of her half-brother. And Matholwch gave in. Branwen was forced from her seat as queen and sent to work as a slave in the hot kitchens, and for 3 years she endured shame and daily beatings, alone, without a friend in the world, condemned to suffer for the sins of her half-brother, tormented day and night by all around her. But through all this she endured with grace and pride, for she knew that she was strong, and that the only shame she could not endure was that she had ever chosen such a weak man to be her husband. But then, one day, she happened upon a baby starling, and she remembered with fondness how she had taught her mother's starlings to speak when she was a child. And an idea arose in her, bringing with it the first light of hope that she had felt in 3 long years. She nursed and reared the starling, gently teaching it how to speak, and of her home, and of her brother, Bran. And then, when the bird was at last ready to take flight, and knew where to go and who to find, she attached a piece of parchment to the bird's wing, detailing in her own words all that she was being made to suffer in Ireland, and released the bird into the sky to carry her message to her brother back home in Wales. The faithful bird safeguarded her words, carrying them as swiftly as its wings were able into the hands of Bran, and when he had last heard of the cruelty that was being wrought upon his sister, he was horrified. He amassed all the men of the Island of the Mighty and set out to Ireland to free his sister. And when the Irish saw Bran and his army approaching them from across the sea, Bran, giant as he was, wading through the water with his mighty fleet sailing by his shoulders and his harpers upon his back, They thought that a mountain and a forest of trees had uprooted themselves from the earth and were crossing the sea to attack them. And when they reached the old river Llynon, the men of Ireland attempted to thwart them by destroying the bridge that would allow them to cross. However, Bran merely proclaimed, "He that would lead, let him be a bridge. I will be that bridge." And with that, he lay across the river and let his army walk across him to the other side. Matholwch quickly attempted to negotiate a peace with Bran, and with Branwen's sage advice and her urgings for a peaceful settlement to prevent further damage to the country, Bran accepted, on the terms that Branwen be freed, her son Gwern be made the High King of Ireland, and that the house would be built, large enough to house even Bran Bendigeidfran. And all this was done. Branwen was released and reunited with her brothers, and the great house was built, with 100 columns inside it, large enough to house Bran, the giant king himself, and a great celebration was held within, with all the men of Ireland gathered on one side, and the men of the Island of the Mighty gathered on the other, and before all present, Gwern was crowned the High King of Ireland. But treachery was not yet past, for Efnisien was dissatisfied with this peace. He had discovered a plot by Matholwch to hide one warrior by each of the 100 columns inside, in an attempt to capture Bran. And though he had thwarted this plot before anything could come of it, his heart once again smouldered with resentment. And as the men of Ireland and the Island of the Mighty celebrated around him, Efnisien took the young boy Gwern and threw him headlong into the fire before him. The men in the hall froze, their hands reaching for their weapons as Branwen let out a heart-shattering cry, and Bran held her back as she tried to jump into the flames after her son. And with that began the most devastating war that these lands had ever seen. Both Ireland and the Island of the Mighty were laid to waste as the fighting raged on both sides, and as the numbers of the dead rose higher and higher, Matholwch and the men of Ireland began to use the cauldron of rebirth. Into the cauldron they threw their dead warriors until it was full to the brim, and they arose once more to fight until the dead outweighed the living, and their numbers far outweighed the men of the Island of the Mighty. And as Efnisien looked about him, at the dead warriors and the destruction that he had brought down upon his own people, he felt the keen stab of guilt and shame pierce his heart, and accepting responsibility for the carnage, he decided to sacrifice himself with one last trick to save his people. He laid himself amongst the dead Irish warriors so that he would be thrown into the cauldron while he was still alive. And with that, the cauldron broke into 4 pieces, and the war was ended. Out of all the men of the Island of the Mighty, only 7 survived, along with Branwen, and they returned home with the head of Bran Bendigeidfran, which they buried under the White Mound in Caer Llyndain, to protect the land from ever experiencing such destruction again at the hands of outside invaders. And Branwen, seeing the desolation of her 2 lands and peoples, unable to bear the devastation surrounding her, died of a broken heart, and was buried at Glan Alaw in Anglesey under a 4-sided grave. Branwen, even now, is considered a goddess of love and beauty, and it is indeed love that pervades her story. With love, she seeks to unite the 2 lands of Cymru and Ireland. With love and compassion, she forgives and continues to seek peace, even after all of her suffering, and at her end, she died of a broken heart at the destruction of her beloved lands and peoples. A tragic but befitting tale of a woman whose ability to see so clearly the greater scheme of things always weighed so heavily upon her, and whose very heart beat for the love of her brothers, her child, her lands, and her people.